Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you the best folder structure for any React application to follow. I'm going to give you my tips and tricks on how to properly folder or structure your folders, structure React application and your React project eventually, and how to put components, where to put the utils files, and how to put all these folders inside of each other. Of course, there is a huge conflict of how different developers across the internet actually love to put their folder structures, and I totally agree with all of them. This is just my own preference and this is what it works for me, and of course this is what I found most of the developers, yes, I'm saying most of them, because this boilerplate I'm going to show you throughout the video is actually what I've actually used across the many years I've worked with React, with other team members, and what works for me and what other wrong stuff I did throughout my career and those kind of stuff. So I'm going to show you step by step on how to do that and tips and tricks. And of course, we're going to go through this process by comparing two projects. One on my right side in here is actually a bad structured project, and one on my left side in here is actually the good structured code projects. So we're going to show bad stuff or wrong stuff we did on this right project, and we're going to compare it to the the bad stuff or what stuff you need to do or good folder structure tips that you need to follow on my left hand in here. So hope you guys enjoyed this one, and without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So how usually Novice or beginners code bases and code structures or project structures actually works or looks like. So here's conclusion here. What I'm having is basically just a Novice project structure. I created this myself, and I'm trying to give you a point of how beginners code structure or how bad code structure or project structure really looks like. So this is a bad code structures. This project still works, still operates 100%. For example, I have other team members collaborating in this, and it works as charm. Let's say this is a medium size to a large company project, which means like at least there is 5 or 6 people working on this project collaboratively. I mean, there's a tons of stuff that going on behind the scenes for this project. So by the way, this project works fine, no issues at all. But what I mean is the project structure is quite horrible, and if you just try to push this project forward and forward for the many years upcoming, this code is going to become a legacy code, or is going to become a legacy project, and you're going to find a little bit hard times maintaining that project, which is quite bad, and you should totally avoid that. So what I mean by a Novice thing is actually this clear in here, there isn't much of a structure that is being followed. So for example, there isn't a way that tells them where to separate. So this components folder basically has everything. Test in here includes every single test for the whole application, which is quite bad as well. The utils in here are a little bit fragmented, but not really that bad. You're gonna find some exclusive, some translations are out on the root folder. And what I mean by the root folder is actually the SRC folder. This is what they're called, the root folder. And you don't want to do that, because any new guy that's going to come through this project and start working in your company and start collaborating in this project is going to try to look for translations, and he's not going to be looking on the roots for translations file like the Dutch in here or the English translations, which is a quite bad thing to do. There's much of things, and that's what I'm going to be doing. So I'm going to just try to compare both of these. I'm going to try to compare this bad project structure and compare it with another good project structure. I'm just giving you this teeny tiny details that you need to put your hand on, just like you need to use and prioritize on any project you work on in order to be able to get the most out of it, and of course in order to just have the best code structure or project structure, and more specifically for the React. So this is specific for React. It could be different for other framework library you're probably using, like Angular has its own project structure, Node.js might have its own Express and stuff like that. So this is specifically made out for React. So a lot of people ask this question is why does choosing the best project structure, or does choosing the right folder structure for your project, of course, really matters that much? And people asking about this a lot. It's basically gonna give you a huge productivity working in this project. If you're maintaining or finding a bug and you have tens of thousands of files around this project, you can be easily finding the file that you want. And this is the most important part, is actually looking or finding the file that is responsible for that particular, feature or functionality that you're looking for inside of that project, which is quite important. You're going to find like a readable code structure, so you know exactly where your components are, where your pages are, what utilities you need, and where like the hooks are, and those functions that were used for once and the other functions are used for once, yada yada yada, those specific stuff. You're also going to have like a really good team collaboration. So if people are working on some files, they will require less files to be changed and pushed and commit, while my other folder structures can abuse or making these team members have more files can be changed, while no need for that in a good folder structure. So you know what I mean in here. And of course it will eliminate legacy code, which is impossible to do that for actually all. But what I mean by that is actually, over the years, you're gonna find a little bit easier to maintain a good projects or a really good structured project. So that's the point. Now let's try to see the differences and actually start with the most important part. So in here, I have two projects. This from the left side is actually a good structured project, and from the right hand side in here is quite a novice and beginners and really bad folder structure or React folder structure approach. So I'm gonna compare one by one between both of these to just like see what's the difference and those teeny tiny details. If it just like, how those teeny stuff or tiny things can make a huge difference when it comes to maintaining or actually having a good project structure or folder structure. Here, both of them are using, or they have been, bootstrapped and created and set up using Create React App, so you don't have to worry about any of that. So let's start by first, is actually here if we look into the SRC, just the first look, and this is what you need to basically first start with a project. Any guy, any developer, any programmer who wants to start looking into a project or working on a project, of course he's going to open up the SRC and he's going to just like take his first look on how that SRC is actually structured, just to get a glimpse of what the files there are and how the files are actually interconnected between each other and how all the code is actually talking to each other. And between both of these, honestly, just like a novice or a beginner guy would love to, it would give you the impression that the left one, this project is much better because it includes or utilizes a little bit more folders. So it includes more folders just to organize. And we all know that folders exist to make the code a little bit more organized, and folders just like for organization stuff and to order your stuff and to put them in a specific order so you can easily find them later on and those kind of stuff. So that's the point in here. This is how folders looks from this side. And here there's a bunch of folders. There's this components folder, quite bad. Here there's the components too, but both of these components aren't really that much of difference, but they still have some differences. So let's start by the first more important part in here is actually containers versus components, or basically what most people love to say, containers and components notion. And what I mean by this notion, or what I mean by this folder structure, is actually on a React project, you're always going to find these two files. At least for me, at least what I've tried, most use boilerplates, and most of good code, good projects, you're going to find two of these folders, which going to make you a huge sense. Right here, we find only the components, which basically includes every single React component inside of that. It doesn't matter if the component has a state. It doesn't matter if this is a dummy component or a stateless component. It doesn't really matter for that. Like, that guy who decided to have this code structure or folder structure, what he decided actually to put any kind of React components, any components, functional component, class components, anything, he put it inside of that particular folder, which is quite bad. I'm not saying the worst thing to do, but this is bad compared to this containers component. Now, if we come back in here, there's this components notion, which includes all the dummy components. And yes, I'm saying dummy, and what I mean by dummy is actually the stateless functional components or stateless components. So what I mean by stateless components is actually only the presentational stuff that those components, you call them, you pass them some props, either functions, data props, booleans, those kind of props. You pass them the props, and all the components cares about is actually rendering stuff. So this is what the components is for. The containers, on the other hand, is caring about the pages. So you can take, for example, a container is just like a web page on the website. And of course, many of us cares, or any kind of website, any kind of web application that utilizes React have to this. And why I don't like to call them pages, because they aren't really pages, because in different React projects you can have them in a different way. They can act as a single React or single web application, or they can act differently. So container is a good name for that. And all of these pages are stateless, yes, or are stateful, sorry. Yes, they care about states, they have access, direct access to the states. Either it's a Redux store or whatever, but they have states. And both of these actually uses Redux, and they both have this global Redux store. So for example, the homepage in here is actually a stateless one. If we go into the index.js, which is the main entry point for the file, and this is where you find it. It's just gonna like return an article, and it's gonna render a couple of stuff. There's the prop types. Here it maps dispatch to props, and it maps state to props. And this is what basically a normal Redux stuff does. And it uses some Hydro components. Simple. And all of the other files inside of that are actually related to the home page itself, which is super, super great. And this is what eliminates all of that. So my actual advice in here is always have your stateful, your pages, your components that cares about the state, and which are the main components that calls the other dummy components inside of the containers folder. This way you separate the concerns between the containers folder and the components folder, and we basically can separate the concerns between the dummy components and the stateful components that does really manage and care about the state. So this is a really important. This one is going to make a lot of sense if you have it this way versus having it, without the containers notion. The other thing, you just like look at it and you see it from the first glance, is actually here, there's much of folders, and one folder that is very important is actually hooks. So as we all love the new React hooks feature, we love using our custom hooks. So this hooks folder includes all the hooks that can be used or utilized across the whole project, which is pretty great. So if I'm a developer, I go into the project, I'm looking for a specific hook, where should I go? Obviously, I just go straight through it and open up the hooks folder. Simple, right? There's not much of complication, and you're gonna find all the hooks. And of course, you can organize that however you want, depending on your project, if it has much more hooks or not. But the point is, have all hooks in a single folder. Simple. Now, if you compare to the other projects in here, there is no hooks folder. So where should I look? Okay, I don't know, where should I look into the components? Yeah, I don't know. Maybe the actual hooks exist per single component, which is tragic. You don't want to do that, because hooks are meant to be reused across multiple components. So you need to have them in a single place that all the components can have access to in a root kind of location. That's the point. Now, if we look into the downs, like right over here, there's the use debounce. And this reuse debounce is the same as this one. So they both are hooks, but this one is actually inside a folder. It makes it super good. And because we're using VS Code, it gives us this really good icons, or VS Code theme icons. Simple. But here, we don't know if this is a hook. If it's not the use debounce, if it doesn't start with EUs, we wouldn't know that this is a hook in the first place. The other most important folder that a lot of developers or any kind of application actually utilizes and needs are actually assets. And what I mean by assets are actually images, any sound stuff, fonts or custom fonts if you have them, those kind of assets, like site assets other than code. So for those, don't just go ahead and put them in the root folder as this project is doing. Like for the icon in here, it does exist inside of the SRC. And this is what you actually find whenever you do set up the CRI or create a React project. You're going to find everything in that one. For example, the logo, you don't want it to be existing inside of the root folder. That is ugly and it doesn't make it look good. And for most of people, it doesn't gonna make sense because this is not a place to hold or to put your assets. So this is another SVG, which is a React logo, and you don't want to do that. You don't want to put it there. And the best way is actually to create a small folder for it, which is called assets. And this assets folder is going to have any kind of assets, images, sound, anything that you can probably utilize inside of the code, of course, or inside of your projects, which are not code. So that's what I mean by assets, like side or third-party stuff that isn't code, that of course you need to import it, which basically, this kind of stuff, images and sound stuff or fonts and this kind of stuff. So always separate the concerns and always have a separate folder, and make sure the names are actually, representative of what it actually has, because most people, you need to follow the rules. For example, assets is best, You don't want to call them images because you don't want to put sound files inside of images, and you want to create like different folders. You could, of course, but it's going to make it a little bit more complicated than it's actually simplifying it. So you got the point. The other very important part about components, which are used a lot when it comes to React. So React is just like simple, small components put together to render the actual web page. So for components, always you want to have every single component inside of a folder. For example, as you see, this components file has all the dummy components. For a simple button, what we want to do is actually have the button inside of a folder and all the files regarding the button inside of that particular folder. For example, in here, as you see, there is this button and there is everything that this button is concerned about inside of that particular folder. You don't want to just like have it inside of here like another file. For example, you name it button.js or button.js, you don't care about it. That's pretty bad. You don't want to do that. Like every single folder is going to represent a single component, and inside of that folder of that component, you put every single file that is related to that component, that the component uses, needs. You maybe want to like separate these components into different components just to make the code a little bit more easier to read and stuff like that. You always want to put it in a single file or folder, sorry, and like utilize that everything. So as in here, this component has some style button, which utilizes this, has the wrapper, which utilizes this, and they all gonna go into being utilized inside of this main button components that is gonna be eventually exported, and it can be imported by another components and gets rendered. So simple as that. This is the base approach to go ahead and do that. This file or this project structure also utilizes this, but not really that much, because it tries to go in and import some global stuff, which you always need to ignore. I'm pretty sure it's impossible to 100% ignore that, but you always want to make sure, like for your components, that they only utilize what they have inside of their folder. They don't want that just like go outside of the scope, which is outside of their folder, and grab something else outside of the location from, around like the root or any other component and use that. For example, you can go out and use another CSS style. Like for example, this button can go ahead and grab something from this like a style thing, or goes and grab something completely different. You don't want to do that. This could be really, really bad. It can make the project structure go really bad and like just gonna give you a messy code and messy component structure. The other most important part you need to care about is actually naming your components. And I mean it. Naming or properly choosing the names for your components is very, very important. It's just like a deal breaker for you. So what you want to do there, seriously, here if we compare two of these projects, this is a button and this is the same button literally. But if we take a look on this one, it has some serious issue because this button includes another button.js. That doesn't make sense. For me as a developer, if I go inside of that folder, I don't know where actually the root thing, where like the main exported or the main components file, like the root main file, where is it? We don't know that. It's probably obvious here because it's button.js, but it could be a different name. That would be bad, and you don't want to do that. So how you want to call it, it's actually the same way you want to call it right over here. So as clear as there's button, and inside of it there's the index.js. So you immediately realize this index.js is actually the entry point of this component. And that's pretty simple, right? You just go through it, select the folder, and you know, oh, that's the index.js. Yes, this is where you need to access, and this is the root thing that I need to first check, read the code, then of course I can access all the files to understand how it's properly structured. But pretty simply, the button in here is really, really bad if you want to name it the same way as this. And the imports are going to be really bad. So if we go back into the homepage here and we go to like homepage.js, this is the same way as the other one. It has homepage and homepage.js. You don't want to do that. You could probably name this index.js. That would be much simpler. And if you go back in here, and let's say I want to import, I don't know if I have this right here or not, but let's say I want to import a simple button, okay? I can go ahead and do this. Let me just go ahead and put that all the way up. And what I'm going to do is actually import a button. And let's say I want to go ahead and import button. I think this is a default import. So you go ahead and import that, you go back. I think you need to go back only once. You go button, then to access the actual button, you have to still to go inside of the button, and that is actually ugly. Look at this import. It doesn't really make sense. You go inside of button to import a button. Really, really that bad. It doesn't really make any sense. Now compared to the other one, how does that look like? If I go right over here, Sorry, I don't know, have everything messed up here. So if I do go into the actual home page, I can go to like the containers, and I can figure out the home page, index.js. That's a much simpler one because it uses the index. And if I go ahead and try to import the button, I go button, and I go back once, back twice. I think here where the components actually exist. So you go inside of components, you access the button, and that's it. Now the button is going to be exported for you, and you don't need to do anything else other than that. You don't need to access another ugly button name, and that will make it really ugly and really confusing. So the index.js can save your life. It's much simpler, it's much easier to use, and I totally agree just going and using that because that's the best way to approach and naming your components inside of that particular structure. What you also want to do is actually name your components properly. And what I mean by this is actually if you access the components, for example, this wrapper component is inside of the button, now you're going to find this file is named wrapper.js, right? And as a developer, for me at least, I'm actually supposed to find, as soon as I go inside of that file, when I open the file, I'm supposed to find another wrapper component that is named exactly wrapper, the same name as the file name. But all of a sudden, I find something completely different. I find the wrapper container and being exported as a wrapper container. That's pretty confusing. And I still go ahead and need to look for another component that is named wrapper because that's what it's supposed to be. But that's not the case in here, and that is actually a bad approach. So what you always want to do is actually name your components, or your file names needs to match your component's name. That's actually a rule that you need to follow. I found a lot of issues when I wasn't actually following this rule in the past couple of years, and it's much simpler now when you use actually the same file name for the same components inside of that particular file. It just makes a lot of sense. So for example, for this, the wrapper, inside of it, straight through, you're going to find another wrapper. Pretty simple. But what you see in here, an issue in two projects, and this is for me not an issue, which are named exports versus default exports. And here both of them are used and utilized as default exports because that's totally simple. And the part here, what I'm saying, why this file uses default exports is actually because there is only a single variable that you want to export there. So why using named exports? But in other case, if you have like multiple variables, a file that has tons of variables that, for example, this index, and for this particular button, you don't know exactly what's being, like exported. There is other stuff, I guess, that you might have like for this list, I believe, or something like that. So what you want to do for this is actually go ahead and use named exports. And for me, I'm saying just for me, because that's my opinion, although people doesn't agree with that, I always love to using named exports instead of default exports, because default exports always going to pollute your state, always going to pollute the actual scope that you imported from, and you're never going to know the same variable name of the file that you just imported. Because if you use default export in here, for example, export default list, and when I go ahead and import that particular list, let's say inside of the home page, and I want to go ahead and import that particular list. So what I can do is actually import, and I can do list, and I can do like my list or something. I can completely change the name of this, and if I go back to the components, I go ahead and actually access the list. There you go. That still works, right? I still get this same list, but the name doesn't match of the component, and that's the same problem I was talking about. So to get that properly, what you need to do is actually you go ahead and use named export, save that. If you go back in here, now you are forced to go ahead and use the named export, and you are forced to use the same name of the components that is being exported, which is the list in here, because here we used a named export. And that way you don't pollute your scope. You always utilize the same name between the component that declares it or the components that is being imported in it, and that's totally simple. Now I understand that this is a list, and this list is actually existing here, and since we're using the index file, making it much simpler, access it, I know exactly that list exists in here, and of course, that's much simpler for VS Code. As curious in here, whenever it clicks on that list, the cursor starts on the function list in here. So it took me straight into the actual components that I'm looking for. If I did it for like default export, for example, I don't know if I have another default export. I think the button in here is a default export. And if I go ahead, I think if I go ahead and click that, I'm not sure. Yes, courtesy, it still took me here because VS Code now knows that, but for most cases, what happened for me, it doesn't know that, it just takes you to that particular line of file. And imagine if you have like thousands of lines of code on that file, God help you to find the right component to look at. So that's much better to use namespace export, but still, default export can work as well. Now, when it comes to APIs, any React application has somehow to access an API, grab the data from the API, and of course render that particular data, either through GraphQL or RESTful APIs or any kind of API, even Socket.io. So what I love to do that, instead of doing it the old legacy way, which you basically go ahead and create a function inside of that particular component, and what you do is actually, like, for example, load user data. Let's say we want to load the user data, use the use effects, you call that, and this is actually going to load the user from that, and you're actually hard coding this every single time you want to load the user's data. In every single component, you go in and create another function, which is horrible, absolutely horrible. And I've tried to actually move from this approach like a year ago, and I found huge productivity improvement in actually how the code is being imported among different components and how it's being utilized. So what I mean by this is a bad approach. It still works, right? It still gets the user's data, but not really that well. Now, if I go back into the other approach in here, for example, and compare to this, I create this services notion. I basically call it services, and you create a file, or a folder called services, and this folder services has another folder. Each folder represents a specific service that the API or basically can provide us from the API. For example, the API has to offer us users. So let's say user service that takes care of like fetching or saving or managing users in general. If you have posts, if you have images, you call it images service. That, of course, going to take care of images, and yada, yada, yada. It depends on what the API does for you. So each service is specifically made out for a single entity on particular API. And what a service is, it's just like an ES6 class. It has the user services and exports default a single instance. And this is very important. It exports only singleton across like the whole project. And this is very important because any other file that imports this particular user service, it gets only a single instance that being shared among the whole files that are actually importing this. So the whole project gets a single instance of that particular class. So you can have, whatever instances, whatever states you can store inside of that class, that will be perfect. Now for this one, the functions in here are all accessible. So you have this function, for example, to load the user data. It uses async awaits, it uses Axios, it calls the API, it has a catch in here, it gets the response, and of course you can return the response in here. For example, you say, I want to return response, response.data, and this is going to get us through it. Pretty simple, right? Just a single function. Now, whenever you need to load a particular user's data, you simply go ahead and import this service, which is going to give you an instance already. And what you do, just go ahead and call this method inside of that service, and that's going to do the job for you. It's going to grab your users, and that's much better. That's 100% better. That's one of the best features I've discovered myself. And if I was doing it wrong, then when I discovered this feature, it saved me a lot of hours of working and debugging and stuff like that. So totally think to that, and it totally go ahead, and I can say that to you, like, preferably, and I advise you go ahead and use the services notion in here. It's 100% better. The other very important tip is actually about CSS and CSS classes, or sharing CSS between different modules or different components. So my mistake in here on that, the right projects in here, if it goes out of the container has a CSS module. So it uses these modules, which are a little bit bad in 2021. You should pivot and use CSS and JS or style components, whatever you want to actually use. So the point in here is there's actually this .container class, which of course just a basic container, flex container, uses flex column and stuff like that. Now this particular class is being utilized across the homepage, which is a bad approach. And what this is actually having is actually being importing the styles, and it's actually importing that from the container.css. So it's going outside of its own scope, and it accesses basically the container here. It grabs this CSS, which is super bad, and it grabs it in here. Then it goes and renders a div. It passes that class name to the style.container. You don't want to do that because this is actually oversharing, and you don't want to overshare because at least you're not going to be able to figure out from where you're importing and what is being imported and what and different stuff. So always have restrictions on where to share, especially for the CSS, because it could go really, really bad. What you can simply do, go ahead and create another file that takes of that particular container inside of the homepage in here and name it homepage.css. That's simple. Or what's much better, because a container, of course, can be across or used across the whole project, you can have an app.css or any root CSS module inside of the root folder that can be shared across or be used across the whole components. And of course, you can export that and you can, of course, use it inside of the homepage. Simple. The other best approach that I found that works really well for me is actually using style components or CSS and JS and creating separate components for every single CSS thing. For example, in here, for the index, there's actually the same way in here we're doing, which is the same section. This one we are utilizing CSS modules, but for this particular one, we're utilizing the, you look at it, it seems like a single standalone component. It's not. If I access this, if I go into the file, it's actually the section file. And this file is basically uses style components. It creates a new section, like components for us, and it has the style inside of it. And that is actually being exported as a real CSS or as a real CSS hybrid with React component that has the CSS, of course, applied. And of course, you can use it. That's much more readable because I know that's a section and it has its own file that includes everything regarding the styles, regarding literally everything that I'm looking for. I know I have that in here, but there you go. Pretty simple, and I find this 100% much better than doing it the other way. And the last important thing, which is tests, which most of people are ignoring nowadays, but testing is very important, and storing your test files is much more important than the actual test you write. So what I mean by this, if I go into this bad project, there's this test folder, which looks like a root thing that only should care about root stuff, but on the other hand, it's not. It's actually caring about the specifics, the other components. For example, there's this button.test.js, which basically goes and tests the actual button. You don't want to do that. You don't want to have the test separate from the actual components. You just literally don't want to do that. You want to always have the test file just alongside the components of that particular test. Always. Literally always. Just like this will kill you if you try to use it that way. If I go to the other hand, there's always this test folder inside of every single component. I mean it, every single component. There's this test folder and it includes all the tests that are actually important to that particular component. For example, the test, there's the index.test.js, which of course tests the actual button components, that is this particular index.js. Much simpler. And of course, there's another test folder which only cares about the root stuff. For example, here the store test, the actual Redux store test, or the actual, internalization stuff like the AI or I18N stuff for doing that particular text. So this only cares about the root stuff, the global stuff around the projects, and the other one only cares about the actual components that is being put at. So you always want to have to structure your test this way, and this is a much simpler way to do it that one. And yeah, so thank you guys for watching. That was actually for the full video. Hopefully that was actually a quick and really good for you, just to give you all the tips on how to fold your structure and properly structure your actual React code, just to get the most out of your code and have, eliminate the actual legacy code and have the best projects you could possibly have among your team and all that sort of stuff. So thank you guys for watching. As I said before, I really hope you're enjoying that, and catch you all hopefully in the next ones.